Hello everyone and welcome. This is our first session on advanced GIS methods training, retail centres and catchment areas. So I'm Dr. Nick Bierman and I'm hosting the session, and I'm also joined today by Dr. Les de Liga, who's a lecturer in the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Liverpool. So Les, over to you to tell us a little bit about retail centres.
Right, so I am going to talk about retail centres and retail catchments today. In part one, I'm going to cover retail centres and the various concepts related to it. And in part two, I'm going to talk about retail catchments. So effectively, we are going to answer two research questions. The first of which is, where are the retail centres? Where are the retail centres? And we think about the UK here, UK context. So you probably may think that you know where the retail centres are, and that is true, that is correct. We typically know where the retail centres are in our own area or the area we are familiar with. And indeed, every local authority in England and Wales is required by law to produce retail study and map the retail centres. However, no national database exists. So although the councils, local councils, they know their own retail centres, if we want to do any type of research on, let's say, regional scale or national scale, there is no pretty much data that we could use. So for this reason, we have to estimate the extent, spatial extent of retail centres. So there were a number of different attempts. The early one started in the early 2000s at UCL, CASA. They have delineated about 1,300 town centres in England and Wales, which were subsequently adopted by DCLG, then Department of Communities and Local Government, in 2004. Then I am going to cover the retail centres developed by CDRC, and there were two different iterations, the first of which happened about 5 years ago, where we developed over 3,000 retail centres for the GB extent. And currently we are still working on our new retail centres. We have delineated about over 6,000 retail centres, and they are just about to be published on the CDRC website. Of course, there are also commercial different attempts, such as geolytic retail places or government agencies such as Ordnance Survey high streets. In terms of geolytics, it is a commercial product, so you have to purchase that product if you want it to use. So in terms of OS, there's complex kind of licensing process involved, so it's not that easily accessible as they are using licensed data. So let's focus on these different attempts of delineating retail centres for the UK. So first of all, as I already mentioned, was the CASA UCL attempt back in early 2000s, where they developed about 1,300 town centres in England and Wales. And they are mapped here on the right-hand side. You can see that there is a kind of good spatial coverage of those centres, and there is higher density of those centres in the largest urban areas, as we would have expected. They call them town centres, no retail centres, for a reason, because they, in addition to retail data, they also use employment areas. So for these reasons, they call them town centres. They were kind of popular. They were adopted by the government in 2004. And they were used by the government and private consultancies to obtain retail statistics, which are very, very useful. However, looking at them now, they extend, it's a little bit outdated, as they use data from the early 2000s, which is around 20 years ago. Retail centres are allowed to expand or to shrink. So they change, in other words, they change their spatial extent. So that retail centres data set, the DCLG one, also didn't include pretty much any local centres, retail parks, no larger shopping centres. So for this reason, once the CDRC was established, one of the projects which we embarked on was to develop a new set of retail centres, which will have much more granularity, will be much more up to date. So we used a bespoke DB-scan algorithm, and we use LDC point data, local data company occupancy data, in the shape of points, basically. So if you look at this map here, in the little yellow dots, they will denote every single retail units. They show the individual retail units in pretty much all the surveyed areas. They survey most of the centers, but not all of them. So as you can see, in red, we're showing here the extent of the DCLG retail centers, and in blue, the extent of the CDRC 2016 retail centers. So as you can see, the yellow dots, they are, in some cases, massively beyond the red areas, which means that the statistics which were generated based on the DCLG data weren't very accurate, and in some cases skewed quite severely, as more than 50, in some cases like Allerton Road in Liverpool, about 50% or more retail units weren't captured in those areas. So for these reasons, these CDRC centers were much more useful, as they had much more up-to-date extents based on the actual retail units. They were also very retail and consumption specific, which means that we didn't use any employment areas. However, another 5 years have gone, basically. Retail centers, they still have changed a little bit since that time, but we believe that they will change even further and faster in the near future, given the pandemic and large closures of retail centers, conversion into different uses, and so on and so on. So we thought that probably would be a good idea to develop a new methodology, transparent methodology, and using a open source data. As previously, the local data company data which we used is secure data, and you have to apply to use it. So not everyone can just use it for modeling it. So in this attempt in 2020-21, we used Valuation Office agency data and OpenStreetMap data. And we, in terms of methodology, we use hexagonal grid H3, which was developed by Uber, the very same Uber H3 algorithm we use to delineate retail centers. And we use the special resolution 11, which gives us about 25 meters of the edge, or which is about equivalent of about 50 meters of the diameter of the each hexagon. This time we also included Northern Ireland, so we have the entire UK coverage, and the extents are much more up to date as well, as previously we applied buffers. So some of the little housing areas which are very close to retail centers were also unfortunately included. This time we focus only on the actual units. So again, this is the same area as I showed you previously, but so in blue you have the 2016 centers, and in orange the current 2020-21 centers. So you can see that the areas are slightly narrower, so they just focus along the road pretty much, encompass only the retail units. In some cases, as you can see here, we have included, there's a small retail park in Allerton area, and we're also including the retail car parks, as we think that that's kind of important. And there is also more granularity to this version of retail centers. As you can see in this map, that none of these small orange centers, which are currently captured, was captured in the previous iteration in 2016. So they were only in this area, there were only 2 retail centers. Currently, we have a number of smaller local centers as well, about 6 or 7 actually. Right, so so this is how we captured the retail centers, how we delineated them. Now let's focus on a number of concepts related to the form and function of retail centers. So each retail center in the UK will be composed of a number of units, and these units are divided by business types. So there are kind of broad divisions, and there are much more detailed divisions. So in terms of the broad business types, we have 4 different types. Okay, so we have comparison retail, which is essentially the non-food retailing, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And they are shown here on this map. This is Liverpool city centre with all the retail units. They're shown in blue, so you can see they're quite They occupy the primary kind of retail area, and they spatially clustered as well quite nicely. Then we have convenience retail, they're shown in green, so there's not that many of them, so they're kind of scattered around. These are the supermarkets, convenience stores. And then we have services in terms of businesses and leisure, so your banks, post offices, restaurants, takeaways, pubs, and so on and so on. And these are shown here in yellow, and it's quite loads of them, as you can see, and they're scattered all over. And then you've got vacant units as well, but units which are currently not occupied. And they are shown in this map in red, basically. So there's quite a few of them. And that data is from about 2016-17. So currently, given the pandemic, there will be many more red units than there were previously. So each of these broad kind of business types is subdivided further into something we call retail categories or service categories. So for example, the comparison retail is the largest of the types, and is subdivided into 20 plus categories. And these categories include some of them I've given here, some of the examples. They include department stores, fashion, footwear, jewelers, charity shops, electrical goods, and so on and so on, DIY stores, and lots of them like that. And there's even further, more detailed classification called subcategories, which which divides these mid kind of groups into smaller ones. So for example, the fashion retailers would be divided further into general fashion, men's fashion, women's fashion, children's fashion, and so on and so on. Okay. Another concept related to the functional and the structural differences of UK retail centers is called retail hierarchy. And the actual hierarchy has been developed by the government, and it's listed here in this upside down pyramid. But there are different ways of creating these hierarchies as well. But let's just focus on the government one. So in terms of their own hierarchy, we have at the top of the hierarchy, we have city centers. Okay, these are the largest centers, such as Liverpool city centre, Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, central London, and so on and so on. And they typically serve very large catchments, extending much beyond the local council area. The second kind of in a hierarchy are major town centres and town centres. So these are the kind of principal centres in each local council area. So that will be Oxford, Cambridge, Southampton, Portsmouth, Gloucester, and so on and so on. Then we have each of urban areas will have a number of district centres, which comprise a quite significant number of shops, including some chains as well, retail chains and supermarkets and a range of services. And then we have local centres. These are the small kind of centres which we have, but they still have a range of shops serving small catchments. And at the very bottom of the retail hierarchy, it's something we called shopping parade. We did not include them in our retail center delineation because they are very, very small. Okay, these are less than 10 units normally. These are the corner shops where you buy your local Chinese takeaway or the laundrette or something like that. So in terms of the actual hierarchy, there are clear functional differences, as you can see. So there are different types of catchments, there's different retail mix, different uses, and so on and so on. And this is linked pretty much closely to a concept of attractiveness and catchment extent. So, but I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So in here, we have an example of such hierarchies developed for our research. We've got paper here. It's published in 2016, Doliga et al. For Greater Manchester. So we can see that at the top of the hierarchies, we have Manchester City Centre, which is followed very closely by Trafford Centre. These are the two largest centres, retail centres in the entire Greater Manchester, which serves around 2.5 million people. And then we have a number of major towns and town centres, which typically are the kind of towns around Greater Manchester, the satellite towns, just Wigan, Bolton, Stockport, Oldham, and so on. Then each of these local authorities have a couple, 2, 3 district centres and a quite large number of local centres. So retail attractiveness is defined as kind of customer pulling factor that enhances consumer experience in that particular retail center. So in other words, the greater attractiveness, the greater pulling factor, and people are coming from further afield, basically. In research, we capture attractiveness in either qualitative or quantitative way, or a mixture of those two. So in here in this table, I'm showing you different factors, qualitative factors and the proxy measure of them, and quantitative factors and the measure of them. So on the qualitative side, we have things like accessibility to a center, which can be captured, or parking facilities, which can be captured by number of parking spaces, or prices, car park prices, and so on. Got safety, also can be captured by crime rates, and so on. Then we've got vitality and viability, could be captured by a number of factors, okay? But then we have a number of relatively important factors, but the factors which are really difficult to capture, to measure, in other words. So things like cleanliness, convenience, opening hours, or an image of a center. How do you capture, how do you measure image of a center? It's something which is in our heads rather than can be measured, okay? So for this reason, for the modeling purposes, we typically would use quantitative factors, such as center size, which can be measured by retail units, number of retail units, or floor space, sales, presence of anchor stores. So we can have a look how many the most attractive shops they are, or what is the percentage of those shops compared to total number of retail units. What is the retail offer, retail mix, diversity, competitor proximity, and footfall. So thank you very much. So this is end of part 1.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Les. It's just a couple of things it'd be good to have a quick chat about. You mentioned the different ways of measuring retail centers, so the DCLG and then the 2 versions of the CDRC version. Obviously, the kind of how up to date they are is key, and the CDRC 2020-2021 ones are the latest, but the number of units seems to vary quite a lot as well. So for example, the latest CDRC one is more than 6,000, whereas the previous one is 3,200. How much of that is down to kind of different methods, and how much of that is growth, and how do you kind of get your head around the 6,000, and how do you work with them sensibly?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a very interesting question, Nick. Thank you. Basically, it could be argued that normally the more granularity we have, the better it is, okay? But this will be largely depending on the data which we employ and the different assumptions we use. So, for example, the DCLG retail centers, they were delineated 20 years ago. So local data company didn't exist, so we didn't have that much good data. So they have to use different proxies to estimate that. Then in 2016, we used a local data company, which we had a very good extent, pretty much, of those centers which have been surveyed. So we could create relatively good number of retail centers, but they don't survey the very small centers, like local centers and small local centers and parades. Although some district centers have been omitted, especially in Scotland and Wales. So, so for this reason, we used a different type of data this time, the open data, which seems to be capturing most of the retail centers, as pretty much most of the retailers, they have to pay a business rates, so they will be, captured by the VOA data. But also, in terms of the actual assumptions, will determine the number of retail centers. So we used a threshold of 10 retail units. Some other studies, they use threshold of 15. The reason we use 10 is because we didn't want to capture any of the retail kind of parades. Geolytics, for example, the commercial product, they came up with over 20,000 of retail centers, of which the vast majority, over 10,000, are the small shopping parades. However, we are trying to develop a number of retail indicators, which would be useful for various users. And if you have that small number of retail units, then it's very problematic and tricky in terms of methodology, because even the difference of 1 unit will create large proportional differences. Other thing which is in terms of methodology, which determines the number of retail centers, it will be different measures of breaking up the retail centers. You know, something we call continuity of retail centers is really important. So we use normally 100 meters. If there's a gap of 100 meters between 2 retail centers, 2 retail units, then we consider them as 2 different centers. Or if there is a kind of significant geographical barrier, like a large ring road, motorway, or larger river, something like that. So other competitors, let's say like OS, they use a different method, so they came up with a slightly larger number of retail centers. But it is a little bit, you know, arbitrary, but you have to make a decision. But what is really important here, what we try to capture by using local knowledge, extensive local knowledge of our stakeholders, is to come up with retail centers that will be as close as possible to that of people's perception. You know, so if there is a continuity of shops, but people will say, especially in London, that this is called Finchley Road, and the other one is called I don't know, Holloway Road. I'm not sure what I'm not that great with London geography, but yes. So they have to be kind of divided into 2 different centers.
Okay. Oh, great. Thanks. No, that's really interesting. And one other thing I was going to ask was, you talked a little bit about the retail centre attractiveness scores, and then the qualitative and the quantitative side of things. And you mentioned some of the qualitative stuff is quite hard to get a kind of good concept of for this kind of modelling, for this type of analysis. Are there any techniques of including that, or is this something that we have to kind of remember and bear in mind when we're working with the data?
Yeah, that's another good question, Nick. Thank you. Basically, well, let me start with that. There is no uniform definition of retail center attractiveness, right? So different researchers will look at different definitions. Also, you know, it's something which is pretty much in our heads, is a subjective perception, our own subjective perception of what constitutes a attractive retail centers as opposed to that what is not attractive. So that too, it is kind of natural division is between qualitative and quantitative. So for the purpose of modeling, typically we use quantitative kind of factors because it's easier to capture them. However, some of the qualitative ones, they could be captured as well, like the car park spaces, for example, so the accessibility. We also capture them in half model. There is an alpha exponent, which I'm going to explain later, that will capture all the kind of non-linear consumer kind of behavior, you know, and encompass this a little bit into this. But overall, you know, most of the quantitative research will use quantitative factors, which can be easily captured by, you know, measured by different data.
Great.
In our, let me just say, well, in our research, the one from 2016, when we delineated retail centers, we came up with our own measure, which was peer-reviewed and published, and in there we viewed attractiveness as a sum of number of factors related to retail centers. So there were center size, including retail mix, number of leisure units, because some people are very you know, keen to go to a particular retail center if there is lots of pubs, restaurants, and so on. That's a pooling factor. Anchor stores, but we also looked at the negative impact vacant units will have. So that we think that is kind of important as well. So this is kind of qualitative, same time as quantitative factor, because obviously if you have lots of boarded up shops, that will create this not very nice image of a center.
Great, wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Les. That was really interesting. Just to say, this is part one. So if you're doing the training program, there is a workbook to go with this where we explore some of these concepts in a bit more detail and can work with the retail catchments and look at how we work with those in R. So please do give the practical element a go. And we will return with part two, where we get into a bit more detail and we talk about some of the models that we can use for retail catchment areas.